Now, before I go into the Accessible Design 101, just a big disclaimer, I'm by no means an accessibility expert. I have kind of delved into that area for a little bit throughout my career, but it's a very complex and broad space. And the idea behind today is kind of, if you've never been exposed to it, to give you an idea what it actually is. And if you have been exposed to it, maybe you'll see something you haven't seen before, or you'll find that people are asking good questions in the chat, and feel free kind of like to answer them as well if you know good answers to that. So I just want you to keep an open mind, because I think one of the biggest things when it comes to accessibility is people kind of put this kind of box definition on it. And today we're going to explore why accessibility is important for everybody. So let's get started. Before I start, I guess just a little bit about me. I'm currently a senior product designer at Coursera, as Luis mentioned, and I'm now based out of Florida, but I was in Calgary for the last 20 years, and my career took me from WestJet for quite a long time. I spent over 7 years there as a senior designer, to NMAX and Enbridge, so the energy space, and now I'm in tech ed. So it's been an interesting journey so far, and it's every industry has taught me something. And if you're looking for a career in UX design, I think you're going to be very excited if you actually get into this space. And then on the side note, outside of work, I can just tell you that I'm obsessed with cats, like many people are. I love plants. I'm actually very sad about losing my entire plant collection through moving, so I have to start that from scratch. And then I also love to travel. So I've been to over 40 countries at this stage, and there's a lot more to see, that's for sure. So the agenda for today is, as I said, the main idea is to kind of help you understand, if you haven't been exposed to inclusive design and accessibility, what it actually is and why it's important for everybody. So we're going to do a little intro, and then I'm going to go over what universal, inclusive, and accessible designs are, because you'll find that some of these terms get used interchangeably, and then what the future of accessibility really looks like. So when it comes to inclusive design, I was first exposed to it while I was at WestJet, and this was the time where accessibility compliance became a thing for a lot of big corporations. So what we had to do is basically audit the entire website and make it more accessible. And I'll go over ways that we actually did that later in the presentation, but that was my first introduction to accessibility. And I found that as I explored the area, it became very interesting how we perceive accessibility. And so I'm excited to share that topic with everybody today, because it's a very interesting, complex space. Now, let's get started with this little example, essentially. So if you take a look at this graphic, so we're looking at inclusive design versus exclusive design. And the most basic example here is a door handle, for example. So the round door handle that we're all used to using is actually not a very accessible item. Typically, you need be able to twist your wrist or something like that, and that's really the only way, unless you're really creative, to open the door. Whereas on the left-hand side, you can see that the door lever handle, it's actually a lot more accessible, because it introduces a few more ways you can use the handle. So let's say you're carrying your groceries from 4 flights of stairs, like I've been doing in the last couple of months, and your hands are occupied, and you need something other than your wrist to turn the handle. So you can use your elbow in this case with this door level handle. So that introduces the concept of more inclusive design, because you're introducing more ways of using the same product, essentially. So as I mentioned, there's universal, inclusive, and accessible design. And many times you find people using this interchangeably, and there are differences between them. And through my research, I'll go over what I think the differences are that I found for myself, and that might make a little bit more sense. So when it comes to universal design, according to the Center for Excellence in Universal Design, it's the design and structure of an environment so it can be understood, accessed, and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age and ability. So when we think about that, universal design really focuses on building one system that accommodates as many people as possible. And universal design was born out of architecture and environmental design. So the principles of universal design are focused more on attributes of the end result, such as those buildings, layout, and facilities are simple and intuitive to use. So it's really meant as a kind of one-size-fits-all solution, and it's more related to like the roots come from more architectural design, essentially. And IKEA instructions are a good example of universal design because you don't really need to know a specific language to be able to understand them. As long as you can see the instructions, you should be able to follow them. A stand-up desk is another good example of universal design because you don't really buy it for different types of situations. You just buy one and then you adjust the height for whatever your needs are. Now, when it comes to inclusive design, unlike architecturally focused universal design, it was born out of digital technologies in the 70s and 80s. And it stems from creating technologies such as closed captioning, for example, for people who are deaf, or audio recorded books for blind communities. So in a nutshell, inclusive design, it doesn't focus on edge cases, and it aims to accommodate users with specific needs, and in some cases going as far as designing specialized solutions for each need. So in contrast with universal design, inclusive design tries to create solutions for a broad group of people, and it could be multiple solutions, not just one size fits all. Now, there are several principles of inclusive design, although if you search the internet, you'll probably find a million, but this is one of a kind of sample of the 7 principles. And it was most likely adapted from the 7 universal design principles, but it's now more fitted for the inclusive design definition. So number 1 is provide content in multiple ways. So what you want to do is ensure that each of the elements on your interface can be experienced in more than one way, and that all such methods are equivalent in the value they provide. For example, adding alternative text to images makes the image be experienced even without being able to see. Number 2, design with various situations in mind. So users will be browsing your product, for example, in a variety of different contexts, and your interface should accommodate for the range of circumstances. Another example for this would be using dark mode to ease eye fatigue at night, or if you watch Netflix, there's that little skip intro button that you want to use if you've already seen the intro. So now I'm kind of introducing concepts of like accessibility, inclusivity in design that you may not really think of as necessary, but actually improve everybody's experience. But we'll get into that a little bit later. Number 3, you want to maintain consistency and design conventions. So your users need to know what to expect when browsing your product. For example, you should be using the same button color to indicate an action, such as green, or a red button to indicate a cancellation of an action. You don't want to be using a million different button colors that indicate the same type of behavior, because that introduces inconsistency across the experience and might confuse your user. Number 4 is create a simple and intuitive design. And this one kind of speaks for itself, but going back to the Netflix example, I don't know if they fixed it by now, but it used to be, I think, on desktop, when you watch the show and the skip intro comes out, it kind of would slide in and out of the screen. And you try to get at that button, but it sometimes took you several times to actually push the button. So an easy fix would be to have it persistent on the screen, so you don't need the extra effort to be able to use it. And that's where Rule 4 plays in. Number 5 would be collaborate to overcome personal biases. And the best way to overcome your personal biases is to work with people that are different from you. And this is a very key concept when it comes to inclusive and accessible design, because even if you follow all the rules and the compliances and the guidelines, it does not mean that you're going to be providing an accessible experience for everybody. So the most intuitive way and the way to create a successful inclusive experience is to work with people that are different from you and to work with people that have the potential limitations that you want to test for your product. So when testing a mobile app, include individuals with color blindness, for example, so that they can catch potential problematic areas. Number 6 is allow tolerance for user error. And all people make mistakes, and you want to provide people with ways to undo unwanted actions, whether that be including a warning message when they did an action like a delete, and you want them to be able to cancel it without destroying all the data they've collected so far. And then number 7 is test and measure. So you want to test and measure your product at each stage of the development, and that can help you uncover potential setback before you even start production. Example would be using color contrast checker to make sure your users with visual impairment will be able to use your product. And I kind of want you to think beyond accessibility when you think about inclusive design. So I think people who haven't been introduced to the subject before, the first thing they would think about is physical impairments or vision here and cognitive ability or mobile impairments. And that's just a small section of when it comes to inclusive design. When you think about inclusive design, you want to think a lot more broadly. So you want to think about things like location, gender, language, education, age, connectivity, and emotion. So disabilities can be physical, mental, or they can be context dependent, such as these examples. Or let's imagine a pregnant woman, for example, with a bag full of groceries. She doesn't fall into a typical disability category, but it doesn't mean that she doesn't need an accessible experience to help her. Another thing you want to consider is ability bias. So when you first start in this area, we have a tendency to kind of bias everything based on our own abilities. So in my example, I would probably be biased towards people with my specific gender or age, maybe physical ability or cultural upbringing and other potential factors. But I'm just a small fraction across the population. So if I was to base my designs just on my personal kind of environmental factors and my personal abilities, I would exclude a huge chunk of the population. So when you want to approach inclusive design, you want to be able to think broadly and try to eliminate your biases. And that's where working with people who are different from you is very beneficial, because they can help you expose the biases that you're carrying with you. Now, let's take a look at this example. So as we kind of touched upon before, there are different levels of inclusivity or accessibility in design. And there are different levels of disability. So they can be permanent, they can be temporary, or they can be situational. So for example, on the far left, you have a person who needs to use a bionic arm, and this is a permanent situation for them. And then in the middle, somebody just injured their wrist and they lost faculties of their wrist for a temporary amount of time, but it's not permanent. And then on the far right, you see a person driving and they potentially might be holding a coffee. Don't do that. Don't drive distracted, but in our example, that could be potentially happening. And in this situation, they might actually all benefit from the same solution. So that's why it's important to kind of consider context, accessibility, inclusiveness as something that can benefit everybody across the spectrum. This is kind of a famous graphic from Microsoft that helps us illustrate the point further. So if we look at the touch level, for example, you can see that in the permanent state, let's take a look at the C example. We already touched upon the touched. So in the C example, in the permanent state, somebody might be blind. In a temporary situation, they might have cataracts, but they might get surgery and that can resolve. In the situational awareness, it could be same, the distracted driver. So he might be looking down at his cell phone and he's not seeing what's going on in front of him, which creates limits. And when it comes to hearing, you can be deaf, or you might just have an ear infection. That's a temporary condition. Or you might be in a crowded bar and you cannot hear the bartender talking to you because there's a lot of people talking loudly around you. And then when it comes to speaking, you may not be able to speak, or you might just have laryngitis. And once you recover, you can speak again. Or you might have a heavy accent. And this is more of a situational kind of context. So when trying to understand people's disabilities, we just shouldn't just consider them as a personal attribute. They can also be context dependent, which may be temporary or situational. And this is a great quote I found by Susan Goldsman. And she says, inclusive design doesn't mean you're designing one thing for all people. You're designing a diversity of ways to participate so that everyone has a sense of belonging. In universal design, you have the adjustable desk, for example, and that is one device that was made to use by many different people with different needs. In inclusive design, your product might have different functions catering to users with different abilities, or there might even be several products available from the same line, depending what the needs of the users that you have. Here's a good example of more of a contextual inclusive design. So Uber introduced Uber Lite. Originally, it was built for India, and it was designed to make booking rides easier and quicker in spotty connectivity and slower than average internet speeds on basic Android phones and for people with limited data. And later, Uber decided to actually roll out Uber Lite to the rest of the world so that everyone can take advantage of the light version of the app. So the benefit of creating inclusive designs is that they can end up benefiting many, not just the original demographic, such as this example. And it's also a good example of a situational ability. So in this case, somebody living in an area with low internet speeds and bandwidth. So let's say you're not in India, but you're traveling and you have this paid per use phone with limited data. It's going to be a lot easier for you to download the version of Uber Lite and be able to actually get around. And you can thank the inclusive design team for that. Another classic example of inclusive design is text messaging. This invention came from actually Finland's Matti Makkonen. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he's credited with inventing SMS texting. So he invented it for deaf people to communicate, but when SMS offered an incredible new method for saving telecom bandwidth, the world of cellular telecommunications changed pretty much forever. And now we can't imagine our lives without texting. So why does inclusive design really matter? It matters because people aren't static. We grow, we age, we experience temporary and long-term disabilities. And inclusive design allows for greater user satisfaction, and it widens your user base and can reduce costs by minimizing redesigns. So imagine if we go back to the ability bias example, where if you just created products or services based on that limited view, imagine how many people you would be excluding and the potential customer base that you could be attracting if you only approached your product from an inclusive design perspective. And it helps to bring people together and create a stronger sense of belonging in place of division and exclusion. And when you bring a community to people, you can't help but build trust and loyalty for your brand, because you're creating this positive experiences for people, and word of mouth becomes the next natural thing. Now, accessible design actually falls under the umbrella of inclusive design, but it focuses on people with specific disabilities. And it's often mandated by specific guidelines, such as WCAG, which stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And in 2017, there was a Canadian survey done on disability, and 1 in 5, which is 22% of the Canadian population, aged 15 years and over, or about 6.2 million people, had one or more disabilities. And these disabilities are related to pain, flexibility, mobility, and mental health. And those were the most common disability types. So when you're creating products and experiences, if you're not keeping inclusivity in mind, you might be excluding a quarter of a population. And I don't think that's beneficial neither for you, your business, or the people you're excluding. So now I'm gonna play a quick video, and we'll have a couple more of this. And I'll leave it on Louis to yell at me if there's any issues with sound, but I'll go ahead and play it.
Hi, I'm Eldar, 32 years old. Although I have cerebral palsy, I do everything I can to conduct myself like everyone else. But in my own home, of all places, I'm surrounded with furniture crying out, cripple. I'd like to sit on a regular sofa without being afraid I won't be able to get up, to open a regular closet, or even to turn on a regular lamp.
1 in every 10 people in Israel is a disabled person. The IKEA Design Vision gave birth to the Disables Project. Smart hacks making IKEA's best-selling items accessible. The project was created in collaboration with 2 NGOs, Milbot and Access Israel, and started off in the IKEA store with a hackathon of product engineers and disabled people that enabled better understanding of their needs. In the end of the developing process, 13 new products were born, each solving a different accessibility issue, such as sofa elevating legs for easier ascending, lamp button enlargement, special handles for PAX closets, and more. The new products are presented in the world's first accessible living spaces in the IKEA stores. The new models are available for download from the project's website, disables.com, and 3D printing anywhere in the world. So that Eldar, Dina, Pavel, Yuval, Moshe, Daniel, and Miguel can also feel comfortable in their own homes like everybody else.
Now they should come up with products that assemble themselves.
Wouldn't that be nice? So this IKEA is a great example of inclusive design, and look at the way it made people feel. And how do you not kind of get behind a brand that does this for you, that creates the space where you can feel like you can do anything?
Hi, I'm
One second, technical difficulties. So let's talk about WCAG levels. So this is a big thing in the web accessibility space specifically. And WCAG guidelines have 3 levels of conformance that you can meet. So there's A, AA, and AAA. And most of the Canadian provinces and US states need to comply with 2.0 AA or are in the progress of doing so. And in Canada, failure to comply may result in fines up to $250,000. So that's a kind of thing you want to fix in your website if you don't want to lose the $250,000. Now, this doesn't apply to every website. There's a specific category. There's like government, federal, and other institutions that have to comply with that. But even if you don't, you can benefit from making your website a lot more accessible. And again, WCAG really focuses on cognitive, visual, auditory, motor, and speech abilities. And now I'm going to kind of go over a few easy ways you can get started with introducing more accessible experiences in your digital products. And one of those things is content hierarchy. So when it comes to writing code, you want to be able to arrange your labels in such a way that they appear in logical order. So if you're using H1, H2, H3 tags, they should follow the normal sequence for H1, H2, H3. So when screen readers are traversing your website, they can actually, the people using the screen readers can understand the content better and in more accessible form. And your visual hierarchy should also be kept in mind in the order that the screen reader will process it. Another easy way to get started in accessibility when it comes to your website is looking at font size and color contrast. And there's actually a million different tools out there that you can use. So there's, if you like any design tool you're using, XD, Sketch, Figma, they all have accessibility plugins that you can search for that make it a lot easier to build accessible experiences. But in general, smaller or lighter weight text needs to have greater contrast to be legible. And for example, anything up to 17 points, it has to meet the minimum contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1. But as you get larger in font, things get a little bit more free. But there's no reason not to be able to create simple, accessible experiences through color. Like there's so many tools that you can use that that we didn't really have back in the day that you can now incorporate into your product builds and as part of your product build process. This I kind of briefly touched upon. So when it comes to images on your website, make sure you use alternative text and you use it in a descriptive way. So for example, if we look at this picture of a student, if you just say picture of a student and a person who's using your website can only hear the label, it doesn't really give them much context for what's going on. Whereas if you use text such as a postgraduate engineering student working in the new electron microscope lab, it gives somebody an immediate picture in their head of what's actually being portrayed in your content. And then another way you can introduce more accessibility is by using ARIA labels in your code. Now, they're not highly recommended because not every browser supports them. So you want to be cautious of just relying on ARIA labels in your website, but it's definitely one of the avenues you can explore to make your product more accessible. Another thing you can improve is the focus order. And this is especially important when it comes to forms. And many people navigate the web with only their keyboard. And if you, at the end of this, if you want to give yourself a little challenge and just try using a website using only your keyboard, you'll kind of understand real quick how important accessibility is when it comes to website design. So you want to ensure that the user can always tell what their focus is on the page, and the tab and sequence of the elements make sense. And again, it's especially important for screen readers. So imagine if you're filling out a form and instead of following the sequence of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the way that you structured your code might be 2, and then it's 7, and then it's 3, and then it's 8, and the person hits 8 before filling out all the other ones because it wasn't the last item in the sequence. That's going to cause errors that you could have easily prevented, and you're going to frustrate your users. Touch targets, this is especially important for mobile experiences. So you make sure when you're creating experience for mobile, you want to have large enough targets. So you're not trying to like hit the smallest thing with your fingers, whatever devices you might be using. So make sure they're large enough for to be hit easily, essentially. Now I'm going to play another video, and this one illustrates the first example you'll see is when the code is not really accessible and it doesn't make any sense to the user. And the second example, when somebody actually took the time to go through, put in proper labels and information in the code, and the screen reader can make a lot more sense out of it.
Please press Alt and Enter to view this movie full screen. This video shows two versions of the Amazon site in IBM's homepage reader. Read the captions for more information.
Connecting to Amazon.co.uk. Welcome. //tab_nav_2,259,6,723,826. //tab_nav_2,259,6,723,826. Files open type of web address. Open file name. Edit open Amazon open OK Alt plus O app connecting to Z. Amazon.co.uk. Welcome. Start of map with 4 items. End of map. Welcome. Your store. Books. Electronic and photo dot. Music. DVD. Video. Software. PC and video games. Home and garden. Toys and kids. Travel.
So it's really straightforward example of how hard the experience can be And if we took the time to actually write semantic code that makes the experience accessible, that the screen reader can make a lot more sense out of the content on your website. And here's another good example as well.
This is Mark Sutton from the University of California, San Francisco's IT Web Services Department. Here today with a brief tour of screen reading technology. I'm a blind person who has been using screen readers, braille writers, scanning equipment, other adaptive technologies since my childhood. What a screen reader does is, for example, I'm going to start to read this page.
University of California, San Francisco,
And what I will now do is slow down the speech rate.
75%, 70%, 65%, 60%, 55%, 50%, 45%, 40%. Link, UCSF Medical Center.
So as I was about to say, a screen reader converts what's on a computer screen into information that can be displayed through synthetic speech or braille output. And it does that by allowing you to use a computer instead of a mouse, a computer keyboard instead of a mouse. You can also use a braille display as an input device.
And navigation.
And what it does is it cleverly determines what's on the screen and presents you that information in a way that would allow for efficient navigation of these pages. So for example, I could just keep reading.
Banner 3 items. Visited, link, image, home.
Line by line, and we could be here all day. Or I could jump to the first heading on the page.
Heading level 2. Search for heading level 2. You are here. Heading level 1. Make videos accessible.
So as I'm moving down through the page, I can look for the category that interests me. And I'm just using commands built into the screen reader. So that's all a pretty simple description of what a screen reader is all about. Now I'm going to go over and show a few examples of how that can fall apart. So I have a couple graphics on this page.
Mark Sutton hands on the MacBook Pro image.
So the first one is well described and uses an alt tag.
You are currently on it.
To describe what that graphic is all about. Now we go to the next graphic.
Reader 042116.jpg.
Much less useful. So it's important to use those elements. It's also true for tables. So I'm going to move to a table.
FDA approved medications. Table, 3 columns, 5 rows. FDA approved medications.
So the table is pretty self-explanatory, and I'm going to move into the table.
Medicine. Approved. Column 2 of 3.
And then if I go down into the table.
Medicine. Tolbutamide.
And as I move across.
Approved. 1975. Column 2 of 3.
We're getting the labels for the column headers and row headers. So it's important when programming tables, forms, and other elements on the web pages to use the proper HTML codes. I'll go to the
table 3 columns.
Second table on the page.
Medicine. Row 2 of 5 tolbutamide.
And as I'm in the table, I move across it.
Row November 1995.
I get a date, but I don't know what that date is associated with. So it's important, as I was saying, to include proper coding tags for all these elements. These are just a few highlights of a screen reader's capabilities and some of the ways in.
So when it comes to questions you want to focus on when you start your accessibility practice, what is the most important action in the environment? And how many ways can human beings engage in that activity? How can you limit yourself to emulate the constraints of a particular user? And this will give you kind of a good framework to start with. As I mentioned, there's lots of tools that you can use. Just a simple way to get started, take a look at Google Material Design Systems. They have a whole section on accessibility, and they describe it really accessible manner, if you will, and it'll give you a good starting point for what you want to do if you're creating a design system. There's also tools like accessibility testing of your entire website, and it gives you a breakdown of everything that you can potentially fix. There's color contrast checkers that I mentioned. I love using Pika if you're on the Mac. It's kind of standalone app, and it tells you right away if you're 1A or AA, AAA compliant. There's accessible color palette generators that you can find. There's browser extensions that you can add to Chrome and Firefox and any other browser that you're using. And there's accessibility plugins for your design tools. And there's also screen readers. For example, VoiceOver for Mac is built-in screen reader that you can use right away to test websites. And there's lots of other tools. So if you visit the w3.org website, you can find a whole list of them. And what does the future hold for accessibility? So these are just a couple of fun examples that you can think about. And of course, AR and VR is becoming very big. And AR and VR experiences can enable otherwise isolated users to form communities and support systems beyond the bounds of physical distance. And this is going to become more prevalent as Meta rolls out more experiences. And in this picture, for example, a person who's potentially colorblind might be using a device that shows them true colors as they're painting. And that's an experience they would never be able to have otherwise, but that opens up, like, can you imagine just seeing true colors for the first time and how incredible that is? We also have evolution of voice-assisted technology. So last year, Adobe XD rolled out a voice prototyping feature, and now you can actually introduce voice commands into your prototypes. And then, of course, we also have assistive interpretation with AI and machine learning. So this example I actually found on LinkedIn the other day. So this is Danica Martins, and her team, this was an academic project, and they basically built a software that recognizes sign language and translates it to people on the screen. And now you kind of introducing a whole new era of people not even having to speak the same language, whether that be gestures or otherwise, to be able to understand each other. And imagine what you can do with that. So some final thoughts before we wrap up. 60 to 70% of accessibility issues could be avoided at the design phase. So if you start with the framework of how can we make this more accessible, what tools can we use, you're going to eliminate a lot of the problems down the line, which can potentially result in a redesign or even audit that will result in a fine. Accessibility should be an ongoing process. So as long as you're building a product, you should be designing for its accessibility. And you want to focus on the gaps among people's abilities and disabilities. You want to define potential impact for the people, the business, and society. You want to get people with disabilities involved in interviews and usability testing from the get-go. As I mentioned, you can follow a million guidelines, but the best way to test your product is with real users who are facing the challenges. So have them use the tools or tricks they rely on to help them in their quest. And that's it. So I know we received a lot of questions, and I don't know if some were answered in the chat, but I'll answer any that I'm capable of right now, but anything that I don't know, I'll defer to our next event, where we're going to have two really interesting speakers that Luis will talk about right after.
That was really fantastic. And yeah, I guess this is the best way to segue to the part where we start asking questions. And in a way, I would like to address those questions to Diana, but I can see also quite a lot of great designers in the chat. So if you can also collaborate and also share some ideas or resources, that would be really fantastic. So I would like to start with one that seems to be very focused on what's next, you know? So this is the question that says, what's one thing that we can do right now, today, on everyday life that will make the biggest impact on increasing accessibility? According to what your opinion, if you can narrow it down to a single action step, what it will be?
Well, the funny thing is when you start being exposed to accessibility, you're gonna kind of approach every experience that you have with accessibility in mind. So you might be going to places and like, oh, I would have done it this differently. This is the challenge that I would have faced this way. But of course, you can't fix all those problems. So you want to focus on where you can fix the problem. So if you're in UX space, what's the smallest thing you can do at your UX practice? I showed you a few tools that are like start checking with the colors. If you have a person you know that's colorblind on your team, for example, get them involved in testing, and then they can tell you what kind of issues you might potentially facing with the color contrast and whatnot. And there's so many free tools available right now that it makes it really easy to start your practice. So it's just a matter of, okay, where do I want to focus first? So for example, at Enbridge, when Luis and I were used to work together, like there's a lot of field workers, right? And some of them are working at night. And you can talk to them, interview them, and they might potentially say, listen, this screen is way too bright for me to work at night. So can you please introduce a dark mode? So if you don't know where to start, talk to your users. They will tell you what is the most beneficial, accessible experience that you can introduce right from the get-go. And it might be an easiest thing in the world. It might be complex, but at least you have a starting point, essentially.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And also in the same way as you had started your journey to understand more about accessibility, I could imagine that this process or this path has also influenced you as a designer. If you can give us a bit of your experience, how that also transformed you.
Yeah, I think I was completely oblivious to it until WestJet had to comply, basically. And when I started reading, and there were a couple of presentations done at WestJet, I think I might even remember, I think Kelsey Kimura, a person on our team, he did a presentation on accessible design originally, and that was very eye-opening for me. So when, and after having worked on the website, trying to audit, I realized like, wow, there's a lot that we can do to make people's lives easier, right? So when I started switching jobs, that became the number one thing. It's like, okay, as I'm designing, it's my responsibility. Basically, it's not just mine, but it's the whole team's responsibility. But I can take steps that we make that can include creating inclusive experiences for everybody. And it just gave me an awareness, essentially, that we can do more. And it's not, sometimes it's a very easy thing, essentially.
Amazing. And if I can add to that, at least for me, it has been the realization or the acknowledgement that, hey, it's not people, it's family members, it's grandparents, grandmothers, potentially myself in a very near future. And this is the kind of things that at some point, there's so much gap and distance. It's just frustrating. It's like, hey, this is so easy. Why is this is not everywhere? All right, I have another question, and this is more around the kind of like a presentational code or semantics. And this is a tricky one, because this is, if you have an issue with making good alt text, let's say you can make it too long, or how do you keep it concise, or any sort of advice for making good alternative text?
Yes, so you can kind of go into the extreme where you want to be so detailed and create a really descriptive images, but you also have to keep in mind that you're still creating a user experience. So the best thing to do is, how would you kind of approach the ideas, like making an experience concise, but rich enough to understand. And this is where working with UX writers or content designers is actually super beneficial too. So if you have the option in your workspace to work with somebody like that, please make use of them. They're super knowledgeable, and they actually will expose a lot of issues in your content as you're writing it. But if you don't, there's a lot of great resources. Just the other day, we had kind of like a design sessions at work, and one of our content designers introduced a tool. I think it's called Hemingway, and it basically helps you rephrase your content in a way that's understood at a certain level, which may be 5th grade or something like that. So another super useful tool that you can use. You don't have to have a huge budget for. There's a lot of useful resources available out there. Yeah.
I can also see in the chat quite a lot of people typing about resources. That's really fantastic. I will try to keep or export the chat so I can make a list so everybody can enjoy that. please keep on typing. I mean, all of this is going to a really wonderful set of resources. All right, I have another question, and this is more about, well, not that you mentioned voice and Adobe XD. Okay, what are the impacts of voice recognition that, well, you can see that could enable accessibility design?
Oh, I think it's huge. I mean, like, you don't have to go very far with what Alexa is doing and like smart home automation, and how you don't even, you just use your voice to automate the entire home, right? So when we translate that into design experiences, like, for example, you can create an entire app just based on voice activation, right? And you don't need to rely on visuals as heavily anymore because you have that extra avenue. And I'm just trying to think back to how Adobe presented it, but yeah, I can't remember, but I urge you guys to look up the presentation that Adobe did last year. I think Adobe Max presentation on voiceover, and they actually had a lot of good examples of how you can use that technology.
That's really fantastic. And if I can add a small note, I was teaching my grandmother, she's a 94 years old woman with one blind eye, how to use a Google Mini, and she couldn't because she couldn't pronounce Google. It's just hard for Spanish speakers. So she did much better with Echo. It's interesting, right? How we can make simple things just by one single word. All right, so this is another good question, and I guess it will surface quite a lot of organizational structure. And it's like, hey, when you're about to address accessibility, and this is on a project base, what would be the best way to start? Putting it at the beginning, putting it in validation as a phase. What would be the best way to add hints all across?
I think, well, you want to start thinking about it from the very beginning, because you want to be able to think of inclusive experience as you create them, not as an afterthought at the end, but probably in terms of the design process, before you even get into high fidelity designs, I would start thinking about, okay, what are the tools I can use as I'm building out this high fidelity design? As I mentioned, like contrast checkers, like talk to your content writers. How can we present the content in the most concise way? Get your engineer involved and make sure that they are aware that you want to make sure that the focus order in code is proper. Like, you want to get everybody on the same page and advocate if the practice is not established. Kind of, even if you show them one of the videos I showed today, or there's a million examples on the web, right? It's already a powerful impact on people, right? So if they don't know what accessibility is, show them a couple of videos of the person using a screen reader. It might be an eye-opening experience, like it was for me. But if they are aware and they're supportive, just make sure they're involved from the very beginning and they're aware of the expectations. So if there's potential impact on time it takes to ship the product, they account for that. They account for accessibility testing at the end. Like at Coursera, for example, we have an entire team. So they have office hours. You can come with your project to them and they'll answer and they'll expose any potential accessibility issues. So if you don't have that at work, start a group. Like, get this thing going, and you don't have to be an expert. Like I said, I'm not an expert, but as long as you start bringing awareness, other people will come, they'll bring their input, and you'll at some point you'll build this robust practice, especially. Yeah.
It's a great thought, because yeah, certainly one of the things that I'm always concerned is, do I need to know everything? What if I make a mistake? What if people hate me because I did something wrong? It's just no.
That's a general designer imposter syndrome
yes.
situation, not just accessibility. I don't know if maybe some of us will never be cured of that, but you know, you just got to start. Like, you have to start, essentially.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for starting this conversation, for starting this series. I have so many questions. We have so many questions, and I think that this is the best result that we could have from this conversation, is inciting curiosity. And if you don't mind talking about curiosity, if people would like to follow up with you or see what you're doing, what would be the best way to connect?
Find me on LinkedIn. So let me just, maybe I probably should have introduced a slide, but I'll share my page in the chat in a second. And that's going to be the best way to reach me, really.
Absolutely. Fantastic. And yeah, for all the rest that share their LinkedIn also, thank you so much for making this a place where we can connect. I hope you have really great conversations after this. And yeah, as I said.
Sorry, I do have, I forgot to mention one thing. I am also mentoring junior UX designers. So if you go on my LinkedIn profile and you just want to talk to me like about transitioning into UX or any sort of challenges you're facing, feel free to book a session. It's completely free. And I just like to kind of share the challenges that I overcame in my career and I'm still overcoming. So if I can help you in any way, feel free to book a session.